The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across the bedroom walls as Martha Henderson gripped the brass headboard, her knuckles white against the metal. It was 2:30 in the morning on a January night in 1943, and something was terribly wrong. The baby wasn't supposed to come for another 8 weeks. Outside, a brutal Iowa winter storm howled across the cornfields, the wind rattling the farmhouse windows with a sound like distant thunder. Her husband Robert had already run through waist-deep snow to fetch old Mrs. Kaufman, the midwife who'd delivered half the babies in Clayton County over the past 30 years. When the baby finally came at 4:15, the room fell silent in a way that made Martha's blood run cold. The infant was so small that Mrs. Kaufman could hold him in one weathered hand. He was the size of a loaf of bread, maybe 4 pounds, his skin translucent and purple-tinged. His tiny chest barely moved. The midwife's face, usually confident and calm, showed something Martha had never seen there before: fear. "He's too early," Mrs. Kaufman said quietly, wrapping the baby in the cleanest towel they had. Way too early. Robert stood frozen in the doorway, his face ashen. The nearest hospital was in Dubuque, 43 miles away over roads that were now completely impassable. Even in good weather, that was an hour-and-a-half drive. In this storm, they'd never make it. And even if they could, Martha knew what the doctor would say. They'd seen it happen to the Johnsons' baby 2 years ago. Born early at 7 months, the hospital had tried, but the child didn't survive the week. Premature babies just didn't make it, especially out here in farm country where medical care was a luxury most families couldn't afford. "What do we do?" Robert's voice cracked. This was their first child after 5 years of trying. Mrs. Kaufman was already moving, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Get the warming oven on that stove lit. Not the main oven, the small warming oven. We need it at about body temperature, no hotter. And Robert, I need you to empty that drawer from your dresser, the small one. Line it with the softest flannel you've got." The next hour became a blur of urgent activity. While Robert prepared the makeshift incubator, Mrs. Kaufman showed Martha something she'd learned from her own grandmother, who'd been a midwife back in the old country. She unbuttoned Martha's nightgown and laid the baby directly against her mother's bare chest, then covered them both with quilts. "Skin to skin," the old woman explained, her German accent thickening as it always did when she was tired or worried. "Your body will regulate his temperature better than anything else can. This is how women have kept early babies alive since the beginning of time." The baby felt impossibly fragile against Martha's skin, his heartbeat fast and irregular like a small bird's. She could feel every tiny bone, see every vein through his paper-thin skin. He was so small that his entire hand could barely wrap around her pinky finger. And he wasn't crying. That silence was worse than any amount of screaming. By dawn, they had their system set up. The dresser drawer, lined with soft flannel and placed on a chair near the kitchen stove, became the baby's bed. Robert had wrapped hot water bottles in towels and placed them around the edges of the drawer, but not touching the baby. The warming oven of their old cast-iron stove, carefully monitored to stay at 98 degrees, provided constant heat. But Mrs. Kaufman was firm. Most of the time, the baby needed to be held against Martha's skin. The hospitals that save these early babies, they use glass boxes with heaters, Mrs. Kaufman explained as she checked the baby's breathing for the 100th time. But they don't have what you have. A mother's body is smarter than any machine. It adjusts automatically. If he gets too cold, your body warms up. If he's too warm, you cool down. It's nature's incubator. The real crisis came on the 3rd day. The baby, whom they'd named James, still hadn't taken more than a few drops of milk. Martha's breasts were full and aching, but James was too weak to nurse. His mouth was too small, his sucking reflex barely there. Mrs. Kaufman had seen this before. Without proper nourishment, the baby would starve even if they managed to keep him warm. "We need an eyedropper," Mrs. Kaufman announced, "and we're going to milk you like you're one of your dairy cows." It was undignified and awkward, but Martha sat in the kitchen while Mrs. Kaufman helped her express milk into a clean jar. Then, drop by precious drop, they fed it to James using an eyedropper they'd sterilized in boiling water. It took 40 minutes to get a single ounce into him, but it was something. They would have to do this every 2 hours around the clock. By the end of the first week, Martha hadn't slept more than 30 minutes at a stretch. Her eyes were hollow, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Robert took over whenever he could, holding James against his own bare chest while Martha collapsed for brief periods of unconsciousness that couldn't really be called sleep. The farm work was falling behind, but none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except keeping this tiny life flickering. Word spread through the community the way it always did in rural areas. By the second week, there was a rotation of women coming through the Henderson farm. Mrs. O'Brien from the next farm over brought her daughter to help with the housework. Sarah Clemens, who'd lost her own premature baby the year before, came and sat with Martha during the long night hours, sharing the vigil and the eyedropper feedings. Old Mrs. Jensen, who everyone said was touched by God, brought a special tea made from herbs she grew in her summer garden and dried for winter. She claimed it would help Martha's milk production. "You're not alone in this, Mrs. Kaufman told Martha during one of her daily visits. "This is how we've always done it out here. The hospitals in the city, they might have their fancy equipment, but we have something they don't. We have each other." The women shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Mrs. O'Brien's mother had kept a premature baby alive back in 1922 by sleeping with the infant, tucked inside her nightgown against her skin for 3 solid months. Sarah Clemens knew about keeping the drawer elevated slightly so the baby's head was higher than his feet, helping him breathe easier. Mrs. Jensen insisted on keeping the room humid by keeping pots of water simmering on the stove constantly, claiming dry winter air was dangerous for underdeveloped lungs. The techniques they used were remarkably similar to what hospitals were beginning to implement in their neonatal units, though these farm women had no way of knowing that. What they did know was empirical, learned through trial and error and desperate necessity over decades of frontier life. They knew that consistent warmth mattered more than perfect temperature. They knew that frequent feeding, even if the amounts were tiny, kept the baby's blood sugar stable. They knew that cleanliness prevented infection in a baby whose immune system was almost non-existent. The nights were the hardest. Martha would sit in the rocking chair Robert had moved into the kitchen, James pressed against her chest under layers of quilts, listening to his breathing. Sometimes it would be steady and regular, and she'd feel a rush of hope. Other times it would become rapid and shallow, or worse, would pause for seconds that felt like hours before starting again. Those were the moments when she'd press her fingers against his tiny back, counting heartbeats, praying in whispered fragments. Robert kept the stove burning perfectly all night, every night. He'd wake every hour to check the temperature, adjust the damper, add more wood. The warming oven became a kind of altar, its steady heat the difference between life and death. He measured the temperature by holding his hand inside for a count of 10. If it felt uncomfortably hot, it was too much. If it felt like a warm bath, it was right. By the third week, James had gained 6 ounces. It was barely noticeable to look at him, but when Mrs. Kaufman weighed him on the postal scale they'd borrowed from the general store, wrapped in a cloth diaper, those 6 ounces meant everything. He was fighting. His skin was starting to look less translucent. His eyes, which had been sealed shut, began to open for brief moments. And most miraculously, he was starting to nurse, though Martha still supplemented with the eyedropper. But then came the crisis that almost ended everything. On a brutally cold night in February, Martha woke from a brief sleep to find James burning with fever. His tiny body was rigid, his breathing fast and distressed. She called out for Robert, her voice high with panic. By the time Mrs. Kaufman arrived an hour later, having been fetched through snow by Robert's frantic midnight ride, James was having what looked like a seizure, his little body jerking against Martha's chest. "Infection," Mrs. Kaufman said grimly, examining the baby in the lamplight. "Probably pneumonia. His lungs aren't strong enough." In the hospital, they would have had antibiotics. Sulfur drugs were being used with increasing success by 1943. But here, 40 miles from the nearest doctor in weather that made travel impossible, they had nothing but folk remedies and desperate hope. Mrs. Kaufman made a poultice from mustard seed and flour, wrapping it in cloth and applying it to James's tiny chest for 15-minute intervals. Mrs. Jensen arrived before dawn with more of her medicinal teas, this one made from willow bark and elecampane root. They propped James up almost vertically, supporting his head to help him breathe. Martha held him constantly now, her own body exhausted but still producing heat, still fighting alongside her son. The fever broke on the third day. James's temperature dropped, his breathing eased, and for the first time in 72 hours, he let out a weak but genuine cry. Martha wept so hard she couldn't catch her breath, and Mrs. Kaufman had to remind her to breathe slowly so she wouldn't upset the baby. "He's a fighter," the old midwife said, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "And you've given him every chance. Not many babies born that early would have made it this far." The weeks that followed were less dramatic, but no less demanding. The routine continued. Constant warmth, frequent feeding, vigilant monitoring. Martha and Robert developed an instinct for their son's needs, reading signals in the tension of his tiny muscles, the color of his skin, the sound of his breathing. The drawer gave way to a larger basket as James slowly, incrementally grew. The eyedropper became less necessary as his nursing strength improved. The community visits continued, bringing food for the family, firewood for the ever-burning stove, and the gift of their presence during the long, uncertain hours. By April, when the ice finally melted and the roads became passable, James weighed 9 pounds. Dr. Morrison made the trip out from Dubuque to check on the baby he'd heard so much about. He examined James thoroughly, listening to his heart and lungs, checking his reflexes, measuring his length. "Remarkable," he kept saying, shaking his head. "Absolutely remarkable. At 4 pounds and 8 weeks early, his chances were maybe 1 in 20, even in a hospital. Out here in winter, without any medical equipment." He looked at Martha and Robert with something like awe. "Whatever you did, it worked. His lungs are clear, heart sounds good, reflexes are normal. He's going to be fine." But Martha and Robert and Mrs. Kaufman knew it wasn't remarkable at all. It was just what people did out here. You used what you had. You drew on knowledge passed down through generations. You relied on your community. And you fought like hell for every life, no matter how small or fragile. James Henderson grew up to be a healthy, strong boy, never knowing how close he'd come to not surviving at all. He played in those same cornfields, helped his father with the farm work, went to the same one-room schoolhouse his mother had attended. But Martha never forgot those first desperate weeks. She became the woman other mothers called when they faced similar crises, passing on what Mrs. Kaufman had taught her, adding her own hard-won experience to the collective knowledge that kept farm families alive. The techniques these rural families used in the 1940s, skin-to-skin contact, constant warmth, small frequent feedings, vigilant monitoring, would later be validated by modern neonatal medicine. The kangaroo care method, now standard practice in NICUs worldwide, is essentially what Martha did with James for those crucial first weeks. The emphasis on breast milk, the importance of maintaining body temperature, the need for a humidified environment, all of these are now backed by decades of research. But farm families didn't need research. They needed results, and they figured out what worked through necessity and desperation. It wasn't always successful. Many premature babies didn't survive despite everyone's best efforts. The mortality rate for premature infants in rural America in the 1940s was staggering by today's standards. But the families who faced these crises developed a body of practical knowledge that saved lives when medical intervention was impossible. They turned their kitchens into makeshift neonatal units, their own bodies into incubators, and their communities into support systems that rivaled any hospital staff. The cast-iron stove that kept James alive still stands in the old Henderson farmhouse, though it's no longer used. The dresser drawer that served as his first bed is stored in an attic somewhere, packed away with other family artifacts. But the knowledge that saved him didn't disappear. It was passed down, generation to generation, woman to woman, becoming part of the fabric of rural American resilience. It's a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated technology in the world can't replace the determination of a mother, the wisdom of experience, and the strength of a community that refuses to let its youngest members go without a fight. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you found this story of survival and community strength compelling, please hit that subscribe button to see more authentic stories from America's farming heritage. Give us a like if this touched your heart, and share it with anyone who appreciates the incredible resilience of rural families. These stories deserve to be remembered and honored. This video is inspired by real events and the actual experiences of countless American farming families during the 1930s through 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individual or family. James Henderson is a representative character whose story reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farm families who faced similar situations during this era, drawing on documented historical practices and medical knowledge from the period. The techniques described were actually used by rural families and have since been validated by modern medical research, though viewers should always consult current medical professionals for any health concerns.